Welcome to the Cascade PBS Ideas Festival podcast. I'm Paris Jackson, host of the newsfeed on Cascade PBS. Gun violence is the leading cause of death for children and teens in the United States, according to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, a reality that is hard to fathom, much less grapple with. For today's episode, New York Times bestselling author and Revisionist History podcast host Malcolm Gladwell leads a conversation about how Americans get it wrong on gun violence. He sat down with trauma surgeon Dr. Babak Sarani and gun control activist David Hogg at the Cascade PBS Ideas Festival in early May in Seattle. In this conversation, Dr. Sarani shares his perspective as a trauma surgeon and what he's witnessed over the years treating patients who have been victims of gun violence. Hogg, meanwhile, is a survivor of the 2018 Stoneman Douglas High School shooting in Parkland, Florida. Now he's the co-founder of March for Our Lives, on a quest to push for federal and state policies that ensure no child experiences what he did. This is a powerful account from two individuals who've each had their own encounters with gun violence and who hope their insights shift us toward a safer society. Let's get into it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Malcolm Gladwell. I am the host of the Revisionist History podcast from Pushkin Industries. Welcome to the Cascade PBS Ideas Festival. I'm joined today by two wonderful guests, David Hogg, who is the co-founder of March for Our Lives and a gun control activist, and Dr. Babak Sarani, who is the head of trauma surgery at the George Washington University School of Medicine. And so we're here because in my last season of Revisionist History, I did a series on gun violence in the United States, which told all kinds of strange and hopefully interesting stories. We had a story where we went to Alabama and heard about a shooting from years ago. I sat with an ER doctor in Chicago who had grown up in the same neighborhood where he treated patients, and we made fun of the Supreme Court, which is not terribly hard to do. That was the low-hanging fruit of the series. But there was one question that we brought up in that series that I wanted to return to today, which was that I became convinced that there was a disconnect between what's happening on the ground with respect to gun violence in this country and the way we address it from a kind of policy perspective. So what I've done today is I have got someone who's concerned with the big picture policy perspective and someone who treats gun violence on the ground. And I thought what I would do is hold a conversation with the two of them and see if it's true that there is a disconnect and whether we can try and resolve it. And so what I want to do is I want to start with Dr. Sarani. And David, I want you to listen. And then I want you to respond. I want you to respond to what you hear. So it's going to be first half, Dr. Sarani, second half, the two of you. But so Dr. Sarani was in one of my, that's why he's here. I interviewed him for one of the episodes. You are a trauma surgeon in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
That, I'm assuming, is a very different proposition than being a trauma surgeon in Westchester County in New York State.
Probably.
Yes.
I would think so.
How is it different?
Well, I'm not familiar with Westchester, New York State, but I'm going to say that DC is an urban environment. And so in the urban setting, one deals with more trauma. There's more cars, there's more people, there's more activity, there are nightclubs, and all the things that get people into trouble and injured. And, in regards to gun violence, when we talk about gun violence, we're really by and large talking about an urban phenomenon. There are absolutely firearm-related injuries in rural and suburban America. That is a true statement. But they are a very different demographic. So I'll just kind of stop there and see what else you want to talk about.
So describe to me look back on your last month and describe to me the busiest night you had over the last month.
Well, so at George Washington, we are considered a medium volume trauma center. We're not considered a super high, crazy busy, as you might see, for example, in LA County. So to put that in perspective, we have about 1,500 or so admissions. We have about 1,800 patients that we see. And in a medium volume trauma center, 1 out of 4 has been shot. We have a 25% penetrating trauma volume. That number went up to about 33% during COVID. During COVID, it was 1 out of 3 people who had been shot. That number's dropped, but it never went back to its baseline pre-COVID, which was around 15%. We now have hovered at around 25%, and that's stabilized for the last several years. And that's considered medium volume in the United States. The other trauma centers in the country, Memphis, LA County, Detroit, et cetera, will see a much higher percentage trauma, a much higher percentage penetrating.
What's your worst night of the week?
These days, it's unfortunately a little bit of a roll of the dice. In general, Thursday, Friday, sometimes Saturday are going to be the more busy nights. Monday, Tuesday, less busy. But I certainly would never go to work on a Tuesday and expect to get some sleep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wouldn't happen.
And describe to me the patterns of gunshot victims that you're seeing. Are they all the same? What's the kind of range of?
So in urban America, whether you're in Washington or, as I mentioned, LA, Chicago, Miami, wherever you may be, in one of the major cities in the country, the demographic you will see who has been shot, by and large, will be a young African-American male. It'll be someone who's African-American, male, and probably between the ages of 15, 16 to maybe about 25 to 30. We have seen that in the last 10 years, push up. All of a sudden, I am seeing shootings in patients who are now in their 40s and maybe early 50s. That was very unusual back in the day. Those types of firearm-related injuries back in the day would have been more likely than not suicide. Nowadays, we're seeing those as part of the homicide. So there's been that demographic shift, but still the majority are young African-American male. And then over the last 20 or so years, the big difference has been multiple shootings, multiple hits. So, and I'm sure David will talk about this, but it's unheard of for someone in the United States to have anything other than a semi-automatic handgun. Who in their right mind would buy a revolver? And so when you have a semi-automatic, you can expend that weapon as fast as you can pull the trigger, put a high-capacity magazine in that thing, you've got yourself a lot of ammo and the ability to shoot indiscriminately.
Mm-hmm. So to be more specific for a moment, so in the patient population that you're seeing that have been shot, what percentage of those would have been shot more than once?
Oh, almost everybody. It'd be very unusual to have someone who's been shot only once, and if that is the case, much, much more likely than not, that person was not the intended target.
Yeah. And so a typical victim would have how many shots?
Well,
2, 3?
Yeah, it's hard to know how many, when you count up the number of holes in the patient's body, it's hard to know how many of them are distinct shots as opposed to a bullet that went in and then came out again. So we count every wounding as a separate shot because we don't know until we get all sorts of imaging and kind of figure it out. I would say on average, everyone's been shot about 2 times, so they have about 3 to 4 holes in them.
Mm-hmm. And do you keep track of the guns used in the victims that you see?
We don't. The police department does. And the majority, I think, I don't know this to be a fact, but in general, we're talking about 9mm handguns.
Yeah.
Increasingly, though, I will say, and I'm positive Dave's going to talk about this, over the last 5 to 7 years, we have, even in DC, we've seen a distinct rise in the number of shootings related to what are referred to as long guns. You guys would call them assault weapons. And we just had an assault weapon shooting probably less than a month ago. I remember it very well.
Yeah. And describe a particularly difficult case that you've had recently. Tell me some of them I'm imagining you can stitch them up and send them home.
Yes.
Some of them are really hard. Give me an example of a hard case.
The hardest case I can think of right now, thankfully he's alive, he's actually on the internet, but his name's out there, but there's no point in giving his name. This was a gentleman who was in Washington, D.C. He's a retired Metropolitan Police officer. He now works as a school police officer. And he was going to work at this elementary school when someone who was mentally deranged, had an assault weapon, and I think by report over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. He mounted the weapon on a tripod on the 5th floor of an apartment building overlooking an elementary school. The elementary school had a glass walkway that connected, I guess, 2 of the buildings. And I guess fortunately, the shooter started to shoot before the end of school bell had rung, so most of the kids were still inside. He hit the police officer, who was my patient. He also hit one of the kids who had a broken arm, but thankfully survived, hit another woman who I believe also survived. The police officer who came to us, because it was an assault weapon wounding, I mean, his liver was simply missing. We ended up removing over half his liver in addition to multiple different organs, kidney. So he not only has 1 kidney. He got close to 100 units of blood over the first few hours. By all criteria, he should be dead. Most trauma centers have a device that's like a balloon you can put inside the patient's body, and it stops blood flow. You can only use that balloon for about 30 minutes. He had it in his body for 20 hours.
Wait a second, if you can only use it for
30 minutes.
How could he have it for 20 hours?
Yeah, so we had one of our young interns, it's not easy being an intern, on his knees in the operating room underneath the sheets, and every 30 minutes he would call out time, and I would tell him to deflate the balloon to let the body get blood flow, and then the blood pressure would drop. And when the anesthesiologist said the blood pressure's dropping, I would tell him to reinflate the balloon. And we did that up and down until we finally got control of the bleeding. He was not in the operating room for 20 hours, but in the intensive care unit, we continued this dance. And we violated every FDA rule there is. And then we published it as a case report, which is good. And the police officer and I are not very good friends. He was kind enough to give me a picture of him and me with our arms around each other.
Yeah.
It's nice.
How many hours were you working on that particular patient?
Close to 20 hours. I remember going to bed at around 4 or 5 in the morning, and I just passed out. And I just told my residents, here's the plan, and if anything deviates, call me. And I think I probably got maybe 2.5 hours of sleep, got up around 6:30 in the morning, went back to his bedside again. Yeah.
Now, what's your emotional response to doing your job?
You know, it goes from 0 to 100, right? So as I'm sitting here right now, I'm doing my best to control my emotions. It goes from elation to extreme remorse and sorrow. You know, one of the things I learned in medical school, someone said this to me, and it's been in my head ever since. There's only 2 things a doctor can do that nobody else can do. One is to declare life when you're born, and we say the time of the birth, and one is to declare death. And, you know, death sucks. Period.
Yeah.
That hurts.
How many patients come into GW that you cannot save? How often does that happen?
Thankfully, the majority we save. I think our mortality rate across the board for all, that means, you know, car crash and falling down the stairs, gunshot wound, everything. It's probably, I would guess, 2%, 1.5%, 2%. It's pretty low. Mm-hmm. But if you do a subset and you say, well, okay, now the ones that are shot, now they're shot really badly, now their blood pressure's dropping, then obviously that number is going to go higher and higher. And it's going to approach, I would think for a very severely critically injured patient, probably our death rate is going to be about 20%, something like that.
Yeah. One of the ideas that I played with in my podcast series was that you guys have gotten so good that you've made it easier for the rest of us to not take gun violence seriously. Because I remember somebody gave a statistic, I read a study that was done that said if the level of trauma care had remained constant from the 1970s on, the homicide rate in this country would be something like 3 or 4 times higher than it is now. Do you think that's true?
I heard that episode, and I really made me think quite a bit. I'm sure there's an element of truth in that, and I appreciate on behalf of my colleagues and my forefathers in medicine your comments. That's a huge compliment. But I think there's also room to continue to improve. I would certainly never say we're good enough. I would say the same thing. The easiest way to prevent death from injury is to prevent the injury. I know that sounds trite and stupid, but it's true. So just take examples that we've learned over the last 50 years. Seat belts, the way the roads are designed. When you go around a turn, the asphalt is banked for a reason. The way your tires are designed to prevent the car from slipping off the road. drunk driving laws, helmet laws for motorcyclists, on and on and on. We've learned time and again that the best way to prevent injury is the best way to prevent death is to prevent injury. So I think you're right, Mr. Gladwell. Things have improved, and that hopefully has impacted favorably. I think there's always room to improve more as medicine continues to advance, but nothing will ever beat prevention. And that's that's borne out in studies done back in the 1980s when we realized when someone is injured, they follow that probably a death has this trimodal distribution. By far the highest peak, by far, is at the moment of injury itself. So the second peak is bleeding to death. That's where I come in. The third peak is in the intensive care unit because you just don't recover. So the best way to prevent death, the highest peak in the graph, is to prevent the injury in the first place.
Yeah. And here's where, David, don't worry, I haven't forgotten about you over there. I'm about to invite you in but I have I have a question, one more question for you, Dr. Sarani, which is, so how does your experience as a ER doctor inform the way you think about the best policy approaches to ending gun violence? So if I made you, we have a new president, and he says, knocks on your door and says, I want you to be gun violence czar.
Yeah.
You get to do whatever you want. He gives you a magic wand. They have one, apparently. They just don't use it. What do you do with your magic wand?
I'm going to defer to my colleague to my left very quickly here. I'd like to call a friend. I will admit, whereas I think I'm an okay doctor, I'm certainly not a policy person like Mr. Hogg, so I'll answer your question, but I'll turf to him in a second. I think there's a couple of things. At least from my personal perspective, in the United States, we're not going to ban guns. That's my personal belief. There's 400 million guns, there's 300 million people, we don't even know where the guns are, and never mind the Constitution, it's just not a logistically feasible lift, so there's that. However, I do not understand personally why we need the type of armamentarium with no regulation whatsoever. And I was reading this thing I wrote that said you would have, and it's true, you would have a far easier time going and buying a gun today with limitless ammunition than Sudafed. Because if you buy Sudafed, right?
Yeah.
That makes no sense. I think the unlimited access to weapons, whether we're talking about the firearm itself or the bullets, a gun without a bullet isn't all that useful. We have had people who've been pistol whipped. Let me tell you guys, it's easy to fix those people. And then the type of armamentarium that we have, and we can talk about assault weapons and people should or shouldn't have them, what have you. But I would posture that no one should have 1,000 rounds of ammunition and no one knows that person just bought that. You're not defending your kids with that. And you surely aren't going out hunting with that. There's a reason why you have 1,000 rounds of ammunition. And we should put limits on things. That's what I would say.
Yeah. David, you've been listening to Dr. Sarani. I'm curious, before I ask you a specific question, do you have any responses to any of the things he said?
I think the two things that I think about most in response to what I've heard are, one, the people who don't make it to the ER. Truth be told, most victims of gun violence or gun deaths in the United States, 2/3 of gun deaths typically don't make it to the ER. It's because they're self-inflicted gunshot wounds that typically happen in more rural and suburban communities, often with less easy access to healthcare. And typically it's older white men with easy access to firearms that die of deaths of desperation. Mm-hmm. And I just want to touch on this for a minute because I think so many people say this is just a mental health problem when they don't want to address the fact, the shooter in Parkland, for example, obviously he had mental health problems, he had multiple therapists, but he also was an anti-Semite. He also was a racist and talked repeatedly online about how much he hated black and brown people, how much he hated immigrants, so on and so forth. Hatred is not a mental illness. We should not be using mental illness as a scapegoat. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We should not be using mental illness as a scapegoat to avoid talking about the fact of Why are most victims of gun violence and gun homicide in particular younger black and brown men? It's because of white supremacy. Let's be clear about that, right? It's because one of the top predictors of where gun violence occurs the most in the United States is where communities were redlined in the 1930s and 40s. The reason why Parkland doesn't have shootings every day isn't simply because we have stronger gun laws than the rest of the country. We don't. It's because we have a median household income well over $100,000 in our community. That in part benefits from those decades of discrimination, right? And we can't just address how somebody gets a gun. We need to address why they pulled the trigger too. And we do need to address mental health and those 2/3 of gun deaths that are suicides that typically don't make it, unfortunately. But the other thing that I think about too is just how, clearly there's a lot of pain that you have to endure in your job. Telling parents that their kid is they're never going to see their kid again. You should not have to do that, right? Because those kids shouldn't be shot. In almost any other more developed country, you would not have to do that nearly as much as you do in this country if we had stronger laws. And that, the other countries show us that. And what really angers me about that is that, increasingly our politicians are putting our doctors on the front lines of this issue. And of course, there's a role for doctors to play here. But by the time that you are treating a gunshot wound, that is already a policy failure because somebody is likely going to die. And we need our politicians to stand up and have the courage to actually do something about this issue and not just be afraid of the NRA and the gun lobby, but actually stand up for our kids. And stand up.
David, what's the...
Yeah.
So, be more specific. So in response to what Dr. Sarani said, if I'm not going to give you the magic wand, but I want to talk about... Only he gets the magic wand. But I want to talk... So what is if you could only do if you were to make one intervention, pass one bill in Congress, what would it be? What's at the top of your priority list as a way of addressing gun violence?
So, there's a really interesting concept that I learned about in college in the public policy realm in a class that I took with Cass Sunstein and Sam Power, where they talk about this concept of not reinventing the wheel. So if there's a state, for example, that has less gun deaths or the least gun deaths in the country, we shouldn't be trying to just completely come up with a new policy realm and everything like that. We should just look at what that state's doing. And that's kind of what they did with Obamacare, right? How they took Romney Care from Massachusetts and they federalized it and made it the Affordable Care Act. If I could do one thing, it would be to federalize Massachusetts state gun laws. And you might be asking, well, what are those laws? Massachusetts has a gun death rate 70% lower than the rest of the country. And obviously every state is not Massachusetts by any means. But even if we could cut gun deaths by 30 or 40%, that's still a victory. That's 30 or 40% less people coming in to the ER, right? And in Massachusetts, you can still get a gun. I was part of the shooting club in college because I wanted to go and have the tough conversations because the job of an activist, of an organizer, is not to sit around in echo chambers and have the easy conversations. It's to go out and have the hard conversations.
So what are they doing in Massachusetts?
They essentially have an interview process. It's kind of like if you want to get a car, it's a similar process for getting a gun. You need to register the firearm. You need to have an interview with a law enforcement officer. You need to prove that you're proficient and safe with the firearm. And there are certain limits. For example, there's limits on how many rounds you can have in a magazine, right? God forbid. Truth be told, and I know this because I've shot guns my entire life. My dad was an FBI agent. My first time shooting guns was when I was in 4th grade. I've grown up around these things, right? If you need more than 10 rounds to hit something, you need one of two things or both: glasses or more range time. And that's what I would like to see in Massachusetts. And basically you just renew that license. There's two types. There's basically a long gun license or a handgun license. And that's what they have, right? I don't think that's crazy. Is it easy to get a gun in Massachusetts? You also need to go through a background check with it. Is it easy to get a gun in Massachusetts as it is in Texas? No. But guess what? I can't remember the last time I heard about a school shooting in Massachusetts, right? It's a gun. It shouldn't be easy to get because with rights come responsibilities and no right is absolute in this country.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to something you said that I didn't understand, which was when you said that that the cause of high rates of gun violence among African American young men, the primary cause was white supremacy. What does that mean?
Well, I think if you look at the factors that play into why so many people in some of the most historically discriminated against communities in this country have some of the highest rates of gun violence, it's because the lack of resources that are there. And we have to ask ourselves, why is there that lack of resources, right? Mm-hmm. Discriminatory lending practices by the Federal Housing Administration in the form of redlining and other things like that. And also the fact that, I've been in many, of course, I don't know how to address gun violence specifically in any other community than Parkland, right? Because I've lived in Parkland, I grew up there. But I still know the power of asking people in the communities that are most impacted, what can I do? What can I learn from you about your experience, and how can we elevate each other? Because I know if Parkland is safe, but Jamaica, Queens, and New York is not safe, we're not done doing this work, right? Until every child in America doesn't have to fear gun violence inside of school or outside of it. And when I look at a lot of the communities that are the most impacted by gun violence, I see a massive overinvestment in policing and a lack of investment in education, a lack of investment in the things that just general resources. Right, and I think part of the problem that comes with that is, in some ways, how myopic our electoral system is, in that it is much easier to get a cop on the street tomorrow and hire them and train them and arm them than it is to arm our teachers with the books that they need instead of banning them, than it is to arm our teachers with the pay that they deserve and make sure that they're not police officers, right? Because we know in the communities that have the lowest levels of gun violence, they tend to be the ones with the most resources. Right, and it's not because they necessarily have cops on every single street, necessarily.
Yeah,
that's what I mean by that.
Yeah. We'll have more from Dr. Sarani and David Hogg, recorded live at the Cascade PBS Ideas Festival after this.
BECU. You've heard the name, seen the letters. But what does BECU stand for? Simply put, not-for-profit BECU stands for people, for charting your own path, for choosing what's right for members instead of what's profitable for someone else, because they are the reason our credit union exists. So we do everything in our power to help them reach their financial goals. BECU, power in people. All Pacific Northwest residents are eligible to join, federally insured by NCUA.
They always say life's not about the destination, it's about the journey. So why not travel comfortably? Alaska Airlines has the most legroom in premium class, with 4 inches more than standard main cabin seats and more than any other U.S. legacy airline. Plus, when you book a premium class seat, you can also enjoy early boarding and complimentary beer, wine, and cocktails on board most flights. It's time to enjoy the journey. Upgrade to premium class today on alaskaair.com.
At Amazon, there's a way up for anyone because there's something for everyone. Like Jessica, who completed free technical training programs and is getting her bachelor's with Amazon's prepaid tuition.
Even if you have no knowledge or no experience in IT, Amazon has the tools and the resources to teach you. I've been promoted 3 times, and it's been a significant boost in pay for me.
Free technical training programs at Amazon move full-time and part-time employees into higher-paying jobs. Visit aboutamazon.com for more info.
Dr. Sarani, you did a study of mass shootings, and I want you to talk a little bit about why you did that study and what you found, and how that ought to inform the way we think about gun violence.
We did a series of studies. My 2 great partners in this endeavor, one is Dr. Reed Smith, who's an emergency medicine physician, and Mr. Joff Shapiro, who is a critical care paramedic. It was actually their idea to do the study, so they get all the credit, honestly. I was just the guy who typed on the word processor, so to speak. What we did is we set out, with the help of an attorney, we got our hands on several hundred autopsy reports of multiple mass shootings around the country. We did the study 3 times. We ended up having somewhere in the order of 200 or so victims that we were actually able to look at their autopsies. One hurdle, not all autopsies are publicly disclosable, even with the help of an attorney, which makes you wonder why bother doing the autopsy, but okay. So we looked at those 200 people and we asked the question, and these are all dead, obviously, because they're autopsies. Where were they shot? How many times were they shot? Internally, what was injured? And was there an opportunity to save their life? And what we found is 85%, roughly speaking, 85% of them had no opportunity to save their life at all. They were fatally injured at the time of the event. The only way to prevent that death would have been to prevent the event. And we're talking now about the mass shootings. We're talking about the Parklands, Pulse nightclub, Route 91, which was the Mandalay Bay, Las Vegas shooting, San Bernardino, Columbine, on and on. In the other 15%, we did not say that they were preventable per se, because it's hard to say. Who am I to say what is preventable and what isn't preventable post facto? We just said they were potentially preventable. Had they gotten to the hospital in time, there is a chance that perhaps they could have been saved. It's a lot of adjectives there, based on the nature of the wounding. And the problem is getting the fire department and the paramedics to infiltrate that scene as quickly as possible when there's an active shooter. And we helped inform that decision for the fire department nationwide. And I think, I know that many fire jurisdictions have now changed their protocols. They've implemented various strategies. They go by a variety of different names. But the strategy now is get either the police officer to pull the victim out, because police were historically told, don't touch that guy, you could hurt him, right? You're not a medical person. Either get the police officer to pull that person out to someplace safe, or allow the paramedic to go in as soon as possible and then alter the standard of care for the paramedic. So the paramedic would just pull that person out, as opposed to staying there and trying to make sure that everything started an IV and get things going. Meanwhile, there's an active shooter. So fire agencies, police agencies are now changing their response paradigm. The point being, we have to get to the victim as fast as possible. We need to extricate the victim as fast as possible, and we have to get that person to a hospital, to a trauma center specifically, as fast as possible. And maybe we can take that 15% number and whittle it down to something less. Mm-hmm. That's what we were able to demonstrate.
You had an additional finding, though, about the nature of the guns used in the shooting.
We did. We did another study, and this was a happenstance. As we were reading through all these hundreds of autopsies, for a lot of them, the medical examiner would comment on the type of firearm used. Sometimes they would say this person was shot with a handgun. Sometimes they would say this person was shot with an assault weapon. And we realized, oh my goodness, we've got all of a sudden this data trove. And we started to look and ask the question, well, what are the chances you're going to die if you got shot with a handgun versus an assault weapon? Which I thought would be a no-brainer. Like, no kidding, the assault weapon is going to kill you. But remember, I'm going to tell you the answer in a second, but I got to put the caveat up first so you can't forget this. The assault weapon shootings that we were looking at, we're talking from 1999 to 2017, are different than today. Those assault weapon shootings back in the day were from a far distance. Specifically, when you look at Mandalay Bay, which is the biggest one, that shooter was, 1,000 yards away, right? He was on top of the 35th, 50th story of the Mandalay Bay, shooting down on the concert goers. Distance matters an extreme amount when we talk about firearms. Not both for accuracy, but also for lethality. The speed of the bullet matters an extreme amount. So our findings were, from our data set, if you were shot with a handgun, if the shooter had a handgun, you were far more likely to be shot more than once, and thus far more likely to die, far less likely to have an opportunity for rescue as compared to an assault weapon. People have taken that study and said, aha, assault weapons aren't that bad. That is not what the study says. That is not what the study says. And we're actually now trying to go back and redo that study, factoring in the shooter's distance. So for example, Buffalo, right? Looking at these types but it's very difficult to get that information because the government doesn't track it. I actually called the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and I said, do you guys have information on the distance of the shooter to the victim? Do you track that? And they said, no, we don't track that at all. So the government, unfortunately, specifically is not funded and in many ways precluded by law from studying gunshot wounds. So we're literally going through CNN reports and local media reports, which, aren't all that reliable when you talk about something as minuscule as distance. They're going to say, the shooter was in the parking lot. Well, what does that mean? And so we're trying to figure it out. But bottom line to your question is, they're equally lethal in my opinion. A handgun and an assault weapon, it just depends on distance. And if I'm standing in front of you right now and I have an assault weapon, I'm far more lethal than I would be with a handgun because of the nature of the assault weapon.
Yeah. But that, there's so many interesting things, part of that, interesting implications of what you've been talking about. Number one is just that small point, but the thing you mentioned at the end about the difficulty you have in getting information about these cases? I'm assuming it's a lot easier to get information about someone's appendectomy than it is about them being shot in some kind of public event. I mean, that's sort of crazy, right?
It is. It took us. We did another study where we looked at survivors of the mass shootings. The dead patients weren't as difficult to study because a person who's died is no longer considered under the regulatory guidance of research. You don't need their permission. If the state allows you to look at the autopsy, you can look at the autopsy. If they don't, they don't. But if you're alive, then you fall under privacy laws. It took us 3 years to look at the survivor study that we did because there's not that many survivors. David's right. So, you pick a hospital, you call, Maryland Shock Trauma, and you say, hey, guys, I know them all. We're all friends. It's a small world. Hey, there was this mass shooting, and you guys had 2 survivors. Can you give me information on those 2 survivors? And the sheer amount of paperwork you have to go through just to get your hands on those 2 pieces of paper is not worth it. And so they're going to say, well, gee, Bob, if you don't have somebody who can offset my time, no, I'm not going to do that. Especially because when you only have 1 or 2 survivors, it's very easy to trace back to who that person was, and you violate their confidentiality. And so what happened is the universities told us, we'll let you do that, and we'll give you some information on the survivors, but you can never give any kind of credit to the university. Well, hold on a second. Hey, David, can you do a tremendous amount of work for me, and you'll get no credit for it whatsoever, and I have no money to offset your time? He's going to say no. And that's what happened. So it's to your point, it is far easier to get information on appendectomy than this. Nobody wants to look at this.
I mean, this is, to go back to you, David, this is, when I think about this problem, and I think about, if we were to take the long game and say, all right, let's just slow down and stop and see whether we can fundamentally reconstruct from first principles the way we talk about guns in this country. I'm wondering whether both of you haven't touched on a first step, which is right now the conversation we're having is out of proportion to the size of the problem. So one of the things you mentioned, David, was you started talking about the problem of suicide. The problem of suicide is actually larger than the problem of homicide, if I'm right, in this country. But it's talked about this much, right? As opposed to, you were just talking about a constraint on the ability of people in your position to talk in an academic and scientific sense about gun violence. If we were to remove those kinds of narrative constraints, and if we talked about gun violence in a manner appropriate to the size of the problem, would it make it harder for the other side to run so much obstruction? I mean, when I think of what is the great victory of the gun rights movement, it's not that they've changed the conversation, it's that they've limited the conversation. Right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, for a long time on the research note, it's important to note that for most of my life, it was literally illegal for the US government to study the effectiveness of state gun laws because of something called the Dickey Amendment. That literally, until basically from the year that I was born in 2000 until I was 18 years old when we finally we changed the wording in this. Not only was it illegal to study the effectiveness of state gun laws, which had an overall chilling effect on studying the issue in general. It also got about pretty much zero funding. So sepsis in the United States, from my understanding, I'm not the doctor here, but sepsis in the United States kills about the same number of people as guns do every year or so. Sepsis gets over $1 billion. $1 billion from the US government to study it. Gun violence as one of the leading cause of child mortality in this country. Basically, since Parkland, every year it's gotten about $25 million. That's it. Right? We're raising an entire generation of young people who want to do things about this right now, who want to get active, who want to go study public health, who want to become surgeons, who want to do stuff about gun violence and become public health practitioners, but we are not giving anywhere near the proportional amount of funding as we do to other issues to the issue of addressing gun violence for research funding at all. And it's not sexy. That's part of the problem. Like, people are just like, well, we know what the solution is, and the truth is we know some of it, but we need to have way more research on the issue, and we need to make sure that those kids who right now are going through school shooter drills and want to become those public health practitioners, that they can actually get a job studying the public health of this in the first place. And that, the great thing about that We don't need to deal with the filibuster. We can do it through reconciliation, and we don't need 60 votes.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a low-hanging fruit that we could do right now. We also need to have, I want to establish NHTSA for addressing gun deaths in the United States, not just gun homicides, but also unintentional shootings, domestic violence with firearms, and also gun suicides, because gun suicides are preventable. They are. Most people say to me when I bring this up, they say, well, David, if somebody really wants to kill themselves, they're just going to go and do that. But the truth of the matter is, there's a lot more nuance to that than people think. The most common type of attempt with suicide is overdosing. That has a survival rate of about 90%. Well over half of the people who survive their first attempt of suicide do not reattempt. But you do not get that chance almost ever with a firearm.
Yeah.
That method matters. So we need to fund that, and we need to look at what we did with big tobacco, right? You can still smoke in the United States if you want, but we put reasonable constraints on it to make sure that they can't advertise to minors, to make sure that people know the dangers associated with the use of that product. And you can still go and get it, but people know what the real dangers are. We need to show people in this country that having a gun in your household actually does not make you safer, because the person who is most likely to die with that firearm is you or somebody else in your household, either because of gun suicide or potentially you even misidentifying them as an intruder, which unfortunately does not get told nearly as much as the few times where we hear about self-defense gun use.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear you talk, Dave, the two of you talk, to return to this question of, when you look at policy-focused attempts to bring about gun control, in many ways we're going backwards, right? Or at least the court is pushing us backwards. So maybe it's time for, like I said, for a kind of rethink where we just say, let's change the conversation.
If I can frame that for a second, picking up where David just was, he's right. The most common cause of death right now from age 1 to age 19 in the United States is firearm-related injury, period. That's fact. The most common cause of death from age 1 to age 19 is gun violence. Many people will use the word accidental, and he didn't. He used the word unintentional. We have to change our mentality. A 1 or 2 or 5 or 10-year-old who gets shot, that is not an accident. That's because the firearm owner kept that gun loaded and unsecured and readily accessible to the child. So it is all about changing the way we think about guns. And it's not just the government needs to legislate it. We also need to change our behavior. We need to change our thinking. And we have to stop using the word accident. It is not an accident. It happened because you were not responsible with a firearm that you had.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Exactly. And I want to...
One of the... when you were talking, Dr. Sarani, about the difficulty you had in getting data from other institutions, I'm just curious, this is a kind of random notion. What if we did a carve-out on kind of on rules about patient privacy for gunshot wounds, and just said, because this is a public problem of such extraordinary consequence, any data related to a gunshot wound is available to all researchers without, is that a conceivable solution? Is that something that would open the door to others?
It's a good idea. I don't think it's a conceivable solution, because you can start running into privacy laws, and not everyone wants to have their information. You have to get into anonymizing it and all that. I'll step it back one. What if we just start with a registry so we know where the guns are? We know where the cars are. We know where the motorcycles are. We have no clue where the guns are.
Yeah. I was really looking for an opportunity to go on one of my rants about privacy laws, which I have very strong feelings about. I have never met anyone in the medical profession who, when pushed, will agree that they're a good idea. It's the craziest notion of all. Like, let's generate data, but we actually can't share it with you.
Right.
I mean, then, as you were saying about autopsies, why would you have an autopsy if you can't share the information about the autopsy, right? I mean, there's a kind of...
I did say that. That's true.
You did. We have 2 minutes left. Actually, 1:57.6. So the pressure's on. But I wanted to kind of, both of you, yes, I wanted you to kind of finish up a little bit. Where is your level of, David, start with you, your level of optimism right now, relative to when you started, 2018? That was Parkland, right?
Yeah.
Give me your level of optimism on a scale of 1 to 10 then and now.
I think my level of optimism, I feel like there's a fine line between optimism and delusion, and too often they feel like the same thing. Look, ultimately people are like, how do you stay hopeful? For me, it's not a matter of hope, Malcolm. Like it's a matter of, it doesn't matter what people think is possible, we're going to make it possible, right? After Parkland, if we listen to the people that just told us what was possible, the pollsters, the pundits, these idiots on CNN and Fox News that never have been to Parkland and think that debating this problem is what's going to solve it after we've done that for 25 damn years. If we listen to those people who said that we were just a bunch of dumb kids and we couldn't change anything, my mother may not be alive right now. Because after Parkland, we went and we actually did have the audacity to believe that we were going to change what was possible, not because we were hopeful, but because we had righteous indignation at what had happened at our school. And after Parkland, we passed a red flag law that can disarm people that are a risk to themselves or others. There was an NRA supporter that sent a death threat to my own mother that said, F with the NRA and you will be DOA. We used the law that we passed after Parkland to disarm the man that threatened to kill my mother.
Good for you.
And guess what? That law has been used over 12,000 times since Parkland in Florida alone.
Yeah.
That is part of the challenge that we have to deal with here. You're not going to hear about the person who doesn't come into the ER because of the background check that stops that person from getting a gun. You're not going to hear about the shooting that doesn't happen because of the laws that have changed. And I think it's not a matter of how optimistic I am. I think what I look at is the general course of history. And when young people stand up in the way that we have around gun violence, and we say we're mad as hell and we're not going to take this anymore, to reference a very old movie that some of you may know.
I'm old enough to remember that movie.
But when they stand up and do that, things do change, because ultimately young people have the greatest thing that you can have on your side in politics. And it's something that not the Koch brothers, the NRA, or anybody else can buy more of, which is time. And the fact that no matter what the Supreme Court says, we're going to outlive them.
Yeah.
Right? David, and look at it. As one final point. As one final point, I don't want you all to think that everything's going to be solved overnight, but I want you to know the power is within each and every one of you, and it has to be, because no single person is going to solve this. No single person is going to save us other than yourself. We have to save us. Nobody is going to come here, but we are making progress. And the reason why I know that is because the first Gen Z member of Congress, guess what he did before he was in Congress? He was March for Our Lives National Organizing Director. And just after he got elected, he was running as a 24-year-old, Uber driving every night from 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. And he won, despite everybody saying it wasn't possible. We've heard that story before in Florida. He proved them wrong, and he got elected. And his first bill he introduced was for the Office of Gun Violence Prevention at the White House. Less than a year after he was elected, I got to see the President of the United States be introduced by Congressman Maxwell Frost for the creation of the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. Yeah. Right? We're not just staying on, what gives me hope is that we're not just staying on the outside. We've realized if our government does not change our gun laws, we're going to change who is in government.
Yeah. Thank you, David. We are, sadly, I've been told we're out of time. The music's going to start. We're going to be dragged from the stage. But
I don't want to follow that.
Dr. Sarani, thank you so much. David, thank you so much.
And if you want to support our work, go to marchforourlives.com and please donate. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Bye-bye.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you, Malcolm, Dr. Sarani, and David for the talk. This episode of the Cascade PBS Ideas Festival podcast was produced by Isaac Kaplan-Woolner. The live event was produced by Jake Newman and Ann O'Dowd. You can subscribe to this feed wherever you listen to podcasts, and whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. For the latest political, environmental, and culture news from the Pacific Northwest, visit cascadepbs.org. And if you would like to support the work we do, whether it's live events we host or in-depth reporting we do every day, you can also go to cascadepbs.org. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to the on-demand programming of Cascade PBS. I'm Paris Jackson. We'll be back next week with a live session featuring Hannah Rosen and Charlie Warzel from The Atlantic. They'll be digging into AI deepfakes and the election.